Welcome to part 2 of Sonoma County's 12-part Insurance Requirements for Contracts training program. In part 2, we're going to do a brief overview of the kinds of insurance coverages that we require when we contract with other parties. This is a very brief overview, and in future parts of this training, we will look at these coverages in more depth. Okay, first coverage that we're going to talk about is workers' compensation and employer's liability. Does anyone know what workers' comp does? I don't know, but we require all these guys to have it, right? Basically, it provides coverage to an employee who gets injured while acting within the scope of employment for the employer. So every time we contract with another party, we want to be sure that if they are having employees, that those employees are protected by a workers' comp policy, which, by the way, is the law. Okay, so examples of the kinds of folks that we contract with that have employees. Contractors who do construction and maintenance work for us. Tenants who lease space from us. I don't know how many of you ever bought coffee or food from the Soco Cafe. Well, they've got employees working there, and that's a lease or license agreement. I can't remember if that's a lease or a license. I think it's an operator's agreement. Okay, lost that one. Permittees and regional parks issue lots of permits to people to do things. Well, if those people have employees, they could get hurt on the job. Employer's liability covers claims that start with an on-the-job employee injury but are not compensable under workers' compensation. We'll talk more about that in a later part. Just to give you one example, loss of consortium. That sounds like it ought to wake everybody up. Loss of consortium. Okay, imagine that an employee on the job is severely injured and the spouse loses now companionship and consortium. That's not a workers' comp claim. The injury to the employee is the workers' comp claim, but the spouse is claiming mental anguish and loss of consortium and all that stuff. That started with an employee on the job claim, but it's not in the scope of workers' comp. That's employer's liability. We'll look into that further in a later part of our training. Actually, it's in part 8. Okay. What are the basic workers' comp benefits? Well, there are 4 of them. And by the way, they're set by the state. The insurance companies have nothing to do with it. They're set by the state. Medical benefits to cover the medical costs associated with those injuries. Disability, because the person can't work and draw pay. Some of the rehabilitation costs. Not all rehabilitation costs are covered under California law, but some of them are. And death benefits if the on-the-job injury results in a death. All of these are paid without regard to negligence. It doesn't matter whether it was the employer's fault or not that the employee got hurt on the job. If they get hurt in the course and scope of the job, they're entitled to the state-mandated benefits. Okay, the next coverage that we're going to take a brief overview of is general liability insurance. It does more things, but the basic thing that we want to remember is that it covers bodily injury and property damage that occur during the policy period, during the term of the policy. So I could think of lots of examples. You might remember that sometime in the last couple of weeks we had some severe wind. I don't know if you saw this story on the news, but a contractor in San Francisco had a security fence around a construction project. The fence was not properly mounted. The severe winds blew over the fence, and the fence injured several pedestrians. That's an example of a bodily injury claim that occurs during the policy period that would be covered under a general liability policy. Okay, now, the key thing about general liability is that it doesn't cover all bodily injury or all property damage claims. And there are certain things that are excluded. And what we're going to discover throughout these trainings is that the reason certain kinds of things are excluded is because they are covered in other kinds of insurance policies. So, injury or damage that results from the use of automobiles, aircraft, or watercraft, those claims are generally excluded under the general liability policy. Why? Because you get an auto policy, or you get an aircraft policy, or you get a watercraft policy. Most pollution claims are excluded. There are a few exceptions, but most pollution liability claims are excluded from the general liability policy, and so we often require, in fact, almost all the time, we require our contractors to have a separate pollution liability policy. The workers' compensation related claims are excluded from general liability. Why? We already discussed, because they're covered under a workers' comp policy. Professional liability, sometimes referred to as errors and omissions insurance, is excluded from general liability, and that's why we require professional liability or errors and omissions. Can you think of some examples of the kinds of folks that we would contract with, from whom we'd want to get errors and omissions or professional liability? Yeah, Lori.
Engineering consultants.
Engineering consultants, absolutely. Any other kinds?
Architects.
Architects, right. That's part of the whole design professional world. Absolutely. Fiduciaries. Does anyone know what a fiduciary is?
Money manager.
Yes, somebody who has control, who is taking control of the money. Okay?
We have therapists and doctors.
Medical professionals, therapists, and doctors. Insurance consultants. Okay, so these are all examples of folks with whom we contract. They provide services for us, who would need professional liability, and it's not covered in their general liability. Okay, general liability, we're going to discuss more of that in part 6 of this training. Automobile liability insurance. Even though we're not driving, the contractors and consultants who work for us might be driving. So we require it for 2 reasons. It's not covered by the general liability, and we have vicarious liability. Are you all familiar with the term vicarious liability? No. Okay. Vicarious liability means that somebody else is doing something for us, but it's on our behalf, and therefore we are financially responsible. Now, I don't know what kind of parties you guys go to, but if you want to impress your friends, you can throw out some Latin. Respondeat superior. How do you like that? That just means the guy who's higher up the food chain has to respond. That's what vicarious liability is. When somebody does something for you, you have to respond for their misadventures that cause injury to other people. I'd like to give you some examples of auto claims that impacted public entities. I come from the city of El Cerrito, and this is a true story. City of El Cerrito hired a cement contractor, to do some paving. Those trucks, and they've got those big round thingies, right? By the way, the word El Cerrito means the little hill, except it's not a little hill, it's a big hill. And this cement truck was at the top of the hill on Arlington. I don't know what happened to the truck, but he lost control, and the cement truck came barreling down the hill. It's a good third of a mile till it gets down to the flats. On the way down, the cement truck creamed 3 cars parked next to the middle school. Fortunately, the cars were empty. It continued down the hill till the flats, and it hit a utility pole. A transformer popped off the utility pole, caught fire, and landed on the house right next to it and burned the entire house. Fortunately, the person in there was gotten out before she was injured. This is a true story. Now, I happen to see, we have a restaurant at the foot of this street, and the restaurant is up on the 2nd floor. And I was having lunch there. I saw this whole truck come barreling down. Weird. Okay, so did the city of El Cerrito have anything to do with this? Not really, but the contractor was doing work for the city of El Cerrito. Well, you better believe that the city of El Cerrito had required the contractor to have automobile liability insurance. Okay, we will discuss this in considerably more detail in Part 9. All right, professional liability insurance. Principally, it covers economic harm resulting from the rendering or failure to render professional services. So you guys gave some examples before. When we hire a dentist to do dental care for kids in juvenile detention, if the dentist doesn't do such a good job and the kid loses a teeth, loses more than one teeth, that would be an example of professional liability. You'd want the dentist to have coverage for that. A software designer who has a flawed program, we want them to have some kind of errors and omissions or professional liability insurance. In general, we're talking about healthcare, legal, financial, and design professionals. There can be other situations too where professional liability insurance is going to be required. I can think of something that happened at regional parks where they wanted to do some construction a couple of years ago, but there was concern that the construction might damage some sacred Native American burial grounds, and they hired an expert to check out the site before they did the work, because obviously we could be sued if we did our construction in the wrong place and damaged such sacred sites. Okay, we will again discuss this in more detail in a later part. That will be part 10. Pollution liability insurance, right? Okay. Pollution liability insurance is essentially insurance that is required in most construction agreements. It's required of most contractors who deal with hazmat materials, and some of our tenants, licensees, and permittees. Essentially, we're talking about environmental damage to the air, the land, or the water. Most of these claims are excluded from the general liability policy. Has any of you recently or not so recently, worked with a contract that required pollution liability. Yeah, Lori, right, okay. Lori says everyone. Lori is with the water agency, and almost all of their contracts involve either pipes, sewers, or projects near the water. And the possibility of those projects damaging water or land is quite high. It's not all contractors. We had an example a couple of years ago where a local restaurant wanted to expand its facilities, and it needed expanded sewage capacity, and they had to run some extra pipes. And these pipes had to be run over county property. And so we gave them an easement to allow that. You better believe that we had a severe and high pollution liability requirement in the insurance requirements for that easement, because if something went wrong with that, we were going to have sewage all over our property. Okay, this will be discussed further in part 11. Okay, the last coverage we're going to do is an overview in this section of our training is builder's risk. Builder's risk covers the risk of having damage to a construction project while it is in course of construction. Has any of you had an opportunity to work with a situation where you had to have some builder's risk insurance? Yeah, Lori, that's all they do at water agency. Okay, there are 3 different components, very general components of the risk here. First, the building or structure itself could be damaged. Also, there could be materials and supplies that are not yet in the building, but they're on the premises waiting to be installed in the building. They could be damaged by rain, wind, whatever. Also, materials and supplies that are stored off-site or that are in transit. You've seen big trucks hauling all kinds of materials to construction sites. Those materials could be damaged then. So generally what we're looking for in builder's risk coverage is protection for the project in course of construction and the materials and supplies that are intended for the completed structure before they're actually put in. What we will discover in part 12 is that sometimes we don't require this insurance from our contractors. Instead, we provide it ourselves sometimes, and we'll discuss that in detail in part 12. Questions? Comments? Jokes? I won't tell you the one insurance joke I know. That's all right. War stories. Okay, this concludes part 2 of Sonoma County's insurance training program.